The conference room was all glass and cold light, the kind of room designed to make people feel small. Every eye had already decided what Elijah Carter was: a maintenance worker, a man in a slightly wrinkled shirt, someone whose name you did not need to learn. Then the young CEO, Amelia Brooks, leaned across the table, her voice dropping to something only he could hear. "My father knows your name." No one caught the flicker on Elijah's face. Not anger, not fear, just a faint smile, almost sorrowful. He looked up, met her eyes, and answered one quiet sentence that would leave the entire room in absolute silence. "Stay until the end and find out why a single name was enough to shake an empire to its foundation." Elijah Carter was 27 years old, and he carried his age the way a man carries something heavier than years. There was a tiredness around his eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the kind of fatigue that settles into a person after they have stopped fighting the story the world has decided to tell about them and simply begun living a quieter one, on different terms. He was tall enough that doorframes asked for his attention, with hands that were always slightly rough, slightly marked, hands that had built things, hands that still built things, just smaller ones now, the kind that required a Phillips screwdriver and a Saturday afternoon and a small girl sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, watching with enormous concentration. That girl was Sophie Carter. She was 6 years old, with her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which was to say she was both perceptive and immovable in equal measure. She carried everywhere a stuffed rabbit named Wallace Gray. Lopsided, missing one button eye, and beloved beyond all reason. Sophie had owned Wallace since she was 8 months old. She treated him with the seriousness most people reserve for close friends. Sophie's mother had left when Sophie was 2. There had been no dramatic scene, no final argument. Only a morning where Elijah woke up and found a note on the kitchen table that was 3 sentences long and explained very little. He had stood there for a long time, reading those 3 sentences. And then he had read them again, and they had not grown longer or kinder in the rereading. He had folded the note, placed it in a drawer, and never opened that drawer again. He had then made scrambled eggs, fed his daughter, and begun the long, unremarkable project of raising her alone. What surprised him, in those early months, was not how hard it was, though it was hard. In the physical, sleepless, logistical way that makes single parenthood feel like managing a small and very demanding organization with no staff. What surprised him was how clarifying it was. There was no longer any ambiguity about what mattered. Sophie was 2 years old, and she needed to eat, and be warm, and hear his voice, and feel safe. Everything else was secondary to those facts. Once he accepted that a great deal of noise went out of his life. It was quieter inside. Not easier, just quieter. For 2 years after that, Elijah had worked at a mid-sized infrastructure firm across the city. He had been a senior systems engineer, not famous for it, not titled with anything impressive, but deeply competent in the particular, patient way of someone who finds genuine satisfaction in making complicated things function smoothly. He had built systems that ran beneath larger systems, invisible foundations that held weight without being seen. Then everything changed. A project failed. Elijah was blamed. He left the field entirely, took a certification in building systems maintenance, and applied for a technician role at Meridian Tower, the headquarters of Brooks Capital Group, one of the largest private investment firms in the region. Nobody there knew what he had done before. He made sure of it. He showed up every morning at 6:45, signed in at the maintenance desk, and moved through the building with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not need to be noticed to do his job well. He repaired HVAC units, replaced faulty circuit panels, rerouted cabling in server rooms. He worked fast, and he worked clean, and he did not talk more than necessary. His coworkers called him Carter. His supervisor called him reliable. Nobody called him by his first name. The woman who ran the company was called Amelia Brooks. She was 26 years old, younger than Elijah. A fact he had noted without particular judgment. She had taken the CEO position 11 months ago, after her father, Richard Brooks, had stepped back from operations. The handover had been managed quietly, internally, with a press release that described it as a strategic evolution in leadership. Amelia was the kind of person who entered a room and immediately knew where all the exits were. Not out of fear, but out of habit. She had grown up watching her father command spaces, watching the way authority arranged itself around the right kind of posture, the right kind of silence. She had studied it the way other children study how to ride bicycles intently, repeatedly, until it became automatic. She was beautiful in a precise, careful way, and cold in a way that was not quite natural, the kind of coldness that people develop when they have been told too many times that warmth is a disadvantage. She was hard on her teams. She was harder on herself. She had not, in 11 months, made a single major error, a fact she was quietly aware of, at all times, because she was also aware that the people watching her were waiting for one. She had not yet noticed Elijah Carter. But she would. The building was 42 floors, and on the 28th floor there was a restricted server corridor, a narrow passageway behind the executive data center, where the oldest infrastructure cables ran alongside newer fiber lines in a dense, tangled arrangement that made the facilities manager mildly anxious whenever he thought about it. Access required a Level 3 maintenance badge. Elijah had one. He had gone in on a Tuesday morning, alone, because the overnight monitoring system had flagged a thermal irregularity in one of the primary server racks. It was the kind of alert that could mean nothing, or could mean the beginning of a significant cooling failure. He had read the diagnostic, assessed the pattern, and understood the cause inside about 40 seconds. The original installation had used a non-standard bypass configuration in the airflow, routing a legacy quirk from 11 years ago, the kind of thing only someone who knew the building's full architectural history would recognize. He rerouted the cooling pathway, reset the monitoring trigger, and documented the fix on a 3-line maintenance report that he left in the shared system folder. He was out of the corridor in under 20 minutes. 2 hours later, Amelia Brooks was walking that same hallway with the head of IT infrastructure when she noticed the maintenance log timestamp. She asked who had been in the restricted area. Her IT director checked the badge log and told her. She looked at the name Carter, E, Maintenance Level 2, and frowned. She found him in a stairwell on the 9th floor, replacing a faulty emergency light housing. You. Her voice was flat and deliberate. What were you doing in the 28th floor server corridor this morning? Elijah looked up from the housing panel. He did not look startled. He did not look apologetic. He looked. Amelia would later think, like someone being interrupted from something that mattered more than this conversation. My job, he said. That area requires authorization beyond your clearance level. Level 3 maintenance badge allows access for thermal and cooling system intervention. That's in the Facility Operations Manual, Section 9, Paragraph 4. He held up his badge, tapped it once against the panel housing, and went back to the light. Amelia stood in the stairwell for a moment longer than the exchange required. She had been in this building for 11 months, and had never been cited the operations manual from memory by anyone on the technical staff. Most of the maintenance workers didn't know it existed. She recalibrated, and said nothing more. She left. In the elevator on the way back up, she felt something she didn't have a name for, yet not irritation, exactly, but something sharper, an awareness that she had walked into a conversation expecting the upper hand and come out of it without it. The maintenance man had not argued with her. He had not been defensive or nervous. He had simply been correct, and had returned to his work the way a person returns to something that deserves their full attention. She filed that away. 3 weeks later, the Halcyon project was failing. Halcyon was a proprietary data infrastructure rebuild for one of Brooks Capital's largest portfolio companies, an overhaul of legacy banking systems that had been in development for 14 months and was now, with 2 weeks until the client presentation, generating critical errors that the engineering team could not identify. The project lead, a senior engineer named Davis, had assembled a task force. The task force had run 3 all-night sessions. The errors continued. The problem was subtle. It was the kind of thing that didn't announce itself. It lived in the interaction between 2 subsystems that had been built at different times, using different assumptions about how data would move between them. To see it, you had to understand both systems completely, and understand the assumption gap between them, and understand what that gap would produce under load conditions that only occurred during specific operational windows. Very few people could see it. Elijah saw it. He was in the main floor server room running cable diagnostics on a separate maintenance call when Davis's team was there. Arguing quietly around a terminal, Elijah caught the error output on the secondary monitor as he passed a specific pattern. A very particular handshake failure, and stopped. He said, carefully, to the nearest engineer, "Your routing protocol has a sequencing conflict between the legacy transaction handler and the new validation layer. It only surfaces when transaction volume exceeds a threshold that triggers concurrent validation calls. You need to insert a buffer queue between them. The engineer looked at him the way people look at someone who has stepped outside the boundaries of where they're supposed to exist. Davis turned from the other terminal. He was a large man with the kind of confidence that comes from 17 years of being the smartest person in most rooms. He looked at Elijah, at the gray maintenance uniform, at the tool belt, at the slightly worn work boots, and his expression made a brief, involuntary calculation. "We don't need input from facilities," he said. Elijah looked at him for 1 second. Just one. Then he nodded, picked up his cable case, and walked out. Amelia, watching from the glass partition of her office above, had seen the exchange. She had not heard the words, but she had watched Davis's posture, and she had watched Elijah's response, that single, measured nod, and something pulled at her attention like a thread she could not quite locate the end of. She called her assistant in. "Find out everything you can about the Level 2 maintenance tech, named Carter." The junior analyst Amelia assigned to the task was named Claire, and she was thorough. She started with the standard personnel file, which told her almost nothing. Prior employer listed only as private engineering consultancy, education, a bachelor's in systems engineering. Certifications, multiple, current, extensive. References, a single contact number that rang to a disconnected line. Claire dug deeper. She accessed a professional licensing database and searched for Elijah Carter's engineering credentials. She found an active license, first registered 8 years ago. She cross-referenced it with project filings from the engineering sector. Then she stopped. The name appeared in a technical filing from 5 years ago, a foundational architecture document for a system that had since become the backbone of 2 regional financial networks. The contribution was listed as primary. The author's name was there. Elijah Carter. The affiliation listed was not a small consultancy. It was a division of Brooks Capital's own technology infrastructure arm, operating under a subsidiary name that had since been dissolved. He had not been a maintenance tech 5 years ago. He had been a senior architect. He had built something that was still running. Claire brought this to Amelia. Amelia read the file slowly, without expression, the way she read everything she intended to act on. When she finished, she put it face down on her desk and sat very still for a moment. She thought about the stairwell, the thermal corridor, the way he had cited the operations manual by section and paragraph without hesitation. She thought about the error he had described to Davis's team, the routing conflict, the sequencing issue, the buffer queue. She had asked Davis that evening whether the team had identified the problem. Davis had said they were close. They were not close. She knew that now. That night, Elijah sat on the floor of Sophie's bedroom and helped her reattach Wallace's missing button eye. This required a needle and thread and a great deal of patience on Sophie's part because she had strong opinions about the precise location of the eye and communicated these opinions with a precision that made the process take significantly longer than it should have. When it was done, Sophie held Wallace up, examined him from 3 angles, and pronounced him acceptable. Elijah tucked her in, sat in the chair by her window for a few minutes after she fell asleep, and watched the city lights through the curtain. He was not thinking about the office. He was thinking about whether Wallace's eye was actually straight, and about the spelling test Sophie had on Thursday, and about whether the grocery store near the bus stop was still running the cereal sale. He was very deliberately not thinking about the Halcyon project, but the Halcyon project was thinking about him. The next morning, Amelia walked into the main conference room, the glass-walled one on the 31st floor, where the light came in cold and flat and made everything look like it was being observed, and found Elijah there with a facilities crew, running a scheduled inspection of the overhead cable trays. She dismissed the rest of the crew. She waited until they were gone. Then she sat down at the head of the table, which was her way of telling the room that this was not accidental. Elijah continued his inspection for a moment. Then he stepped down from the ladder, placed his clipboard on the tray, and waited. The silence between them had the quality of something deliberate. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping so that it would not carry past the glass walls. "My father," she said, "knows your name." Elijah's face moved the way a still surface moves, when something beneath it shifts, just barely, just enough. It was not alarm. It was not a performance of calm. It was the real thing, the genuine stillness of a person absorbing something they had already, somewhere deep down, been prepared for. He looked at her, He held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he said, quietly, "I wish he didn't." Amelia had not expected that. She had expected deflection, or denial, or the kind of bland confusion that people put on when they want you to believe you've made a mistake. She had not expected 3 words that carried the weight of an entire history. She said nothing. He picked up his clipboard, stepped back onto the ladder, and resumed his work. What Amelia did not know that morning, and what she would spend the next 72 hours uncovering, was this. 5 years ago, Elijah Carter had been the lead systems architect on a project called the Meridian Core, a full rebuild of Brooks Capital's internal data infrastructure. The foundation on which everything the company ran had since been constructed. Richard Brooks had hired him directly, had worked with him closely through 18 months of development. They had talked on the phone late at night. They had argued about architecture decisions. They had, in the particular way of 2 people who disagree productively, built something together that was genuinely excellent. And then something went wrong. A series of transactions in one of the subsidiary portfolios had been misrouted during a system migration window. The error had caused a significant financial discrepancy, not catastrophic, but visible, and in the kind of regulatory environment that Brooks Capital operated in, visible was bad enough. An internal investigation had been conducted. The investigation had identified a flaw in the migration protocol. The flaw had been attributed to Elijah Carter. He had been asked to resign quietly. He had been told that a quiet resignation was better for everyone, that fighting it would be worse, that the company's lawyers were prepared for a dispute, and his lawyers were not. He had a 2-year-old daughter at home, and no energy for a war he was not certain he could win. He had signed the separation agreement. He had walked out. He had never told anyone what he knew, which was that the flaw was not his. The migration protocol had been altered 2 days before the execution window by a senior operations director named Mark Hion, who had made undisclosed modifications to accommodate a side arrangement with one of the subsidiary clients. Hion had covered his tracks. The investigation had found Elijah's fingerprints on the system because Elijah had built the system. Hion's modifications had been buried in a version log that no one had thought to pull. Elijah had known. He had known the moment he saw the incident report. But Hion was close to Richard Brooks, had been with the company for 15 years, and the calculus of fighting that battle alone, with an infant daughter and a separation agreement already signed, had not come out in his favor. He had walked away. He had taken a maintenance certification because it was quiet and reliable and would not ask anything of him beyond what he could give. And he had decided, with the particular finality of someone who has made a costly peace, that he was done with the industry. That was the story Richard Brooks thought he knew. That his architect had made an error, had acknowledged it, and had left. It was not the story that was true. Amelia found the version log on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been digging for 2 days, accessing archives that had been migrated twice and were not easy to navigate. Claire had helped her. Together they had located the backup snapshot from the migration window, pulled the version history, and found the alterations. Hion's ID was on them. The timestamp was clear. The modifications directly preceded the error window. Amelia sat at her desk and did not move for a long time. She had built her understanding of this company on the assumption that her father was, at his core, a fair man. He could be hard. He could be distant. He had not been easy to grow up alongside. He had been the kind of father who attended her school events, and sat in the front row, and was visibly proud, but who also, afterward, would ask what she could have done better. She had spent a long time deciding whether that was love or ambition, wearing love's clothing, and she had settled on a complicated answer that left room for both. But she had believed he was fair. That the people who worked for him were treated according to what they actually did. The version log said otherwise. Because if her father had been fair, if his investigation had been thorough, he would have found this. It was not hidden well. It was only hidden in a place that someone would need to look deliberately, which meant either that the investigation had not been thorough, or that it had been thorough, and someone had chosen not to look at what it found. She did not want to know which one it was, but she already did. Hion had left the company 3 years ago. He had been given a generous retirement package and a favorable reference. Elijah Carter had taken a job changing light bulbs and fixing HVAC units in the building his own architecture still powered, and nobody had noticed. Her father knew Elijah's name. He had called her, once, 9 months ago, before she'd taken the CEO role, when she was still being briefed on company history, and mentioned it in passing. There was an engineer once, he had said, with something in his voice she had not understood at the time. Carter. Smart man. Made a bad mistake. He had said it like a footnote. Like it was closed. It was not closed. It had never been closed. And she understood now what that weight in his voice had been, not regret for the decision that had been made, but for the knowledge of what the real decision had been, and what it had cost a man who had trusted this company with his best work. On Friday, the Halcyon project failed completely. Not partially, completely. The entire validation subsystem collapsed during a stress test at 6 in the evening, taking with it 14 months of development work and a client relationship that represented $38 million in managed assets. Davis and his team had been in the building since noon. By 8 o'clock, they had not recovered a single functional component. The crisis cascaded quickly. Amelia was on the phone with the client at 9. She told them the presentation was postponed. The client's representative used several words that were technically professional, but were not kind. She absorbed them without expression, ended the call, and walked back into the building. The 31st floor was in a particular kind of chaos, not loud, but dense, the kind of controlled panic that competent people generate when they are running out of options and are too professional to show it openly. Engineers were at terminals. Davis was in the corner of the room with his tie loosened, staring at a display with the focused expression of a man who has stopped believing in his own solutions but has not yet admitted it. Amelia walked to the center of the room and stood there. She looked at the team. She looked at the screens. She looked at the architecture diagram pinned to the secondary monitor, the one that showed the overall system structure, and she thought about a stairwell on the 9th floor, and a man who had cited a manual by section and paragraph, and a word he had used 3 weeks ago, sequencing conflict. She left the floor. She went down to the maintenance desk in the building lobby. She asked the overnight clerk whether Elijah Carter had signed out. He had not. She found him in the building's lower mechanical level, running a scheduled audit on the weekend water treatment backup system. He was alone, working by flashlight and overhead fluorescence, moving through a checklist with the methodical patience of someone who has been doing careful, uncelebrated work for long enough that it no longer requires thought. There was something almost monastic about it, the focused quietness of a man who had decided that this kind of labor was enough and was making good on that decision nightly, without self-pity and without pretense. She stood in the entrance of the mechanical room for a moment, before he heard her. When he turned, there was nothing on his face but mild acknowledgement, the kind of expression that means, "I see you, and I am waiting to see what you do next." "The Halcyon system is down," she said. "Completely. Every component." He said nothing. "Davis's team has been working for 3 hours. They can't find the path back in." Elijah set down his clipboard. He did not look triumphant. He did not look "told you so." He looked, if anything, slightly tired. "I can't ask you to fix something I allowed to break," he said. "I watched them dismiss the solution 2 weeks ago. And I walked out, because I've been here before, not at this company but at this stage, where I help, and then the help gets absorbed, and the person who gave it gets walked out the door again." He paused. "I've already made that trade once." The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building's infrastructure above them, a fan cycled on, and the low mechanical hum of it filled the space. "I know," Amelia said. "I know what happened 5 years ago. The version log. Hion. All of it." She let that land. "I know my father knew your name because he was the one who let you take the blame for something you didn't do." Elijah's jaw was still. His eyes were on her, and they were not angry, they were just watching, the way a person watches when they are deciding whether to believe something. "I'm not here as the CEO," Amelia said. "I'm here as someone who found something she can't unfind, and I'm asking you, not ordering you, not offering you something, just asking to help." The silence stretched. Elijah looked past her, toward the stairwell, toward the floors above them, toward the invisible architecture that was still running on the work he had done before any of this happened. "I have a daughter," he said. 6 years old. She had a spelling test today, and I missed drop-off because I came in early to run that water treatment audit." He said it flatly, without sentimentality, as a statement of what was real and what it had cost. "I've been making those trades for 5 years. I know. I'm not looking for a title," he said. or a settlement, or whatever your legal team would call it. I'm not offering any of those things right now, she said. I'm asking for the next 4 hours. Another pause. Longer. He looked down at the checklist in his hand, at the rows of completed boxes, at the careful notation of every system he had checked and verified and signed off on, a record of invisible, essential work. He had been making things function correctly, in the dark, for 5 years. Nobody had been watching. That had been fine. That had been the point. Then Elijah picked his clipboard back up, placed it on the tool cart, and walked toward the door. Show me the architecture diagram, he said. He was at the terminal on the 31st floor within 11 minutes. Davis's team stood back not because they were asked to, but because there is a quality that genuine competence produces in a room, a kind of gravitational stillness, and Elijah had it. He had always had it. It had just been aimed at HVAC units and cable trays for 5 years. He looked at the diagram for 90 seconds. He asked for the error log from the last failed test run. He asked for the original transaction handler documentation, the legacy spec, not the rebuild. Someone found it. He read 4 pages of it in 2 minutes. Then he sat down, opened a configuration interface, and began. What he did in the next 3 hours was not dramatic in the way that technical work rarely is. It was precise and quiet, and occasionally punctuated by a short instruction to another engineer, given without explanation but always, when followed, producing the result he had predicted. He rebuilt the buffer architecture between the 2 conflicting subsystems, rewrote the sequencing logic in the validation layer, and reconfigured the transaction handler to pass correctly under high-volume load conditions. At 11:47 in the evening, the system came back online. All components clean. Davis stood in the back of the room and said nothing. Several of the junior engineers looked at Elijah with the particular expression of people reassessing a very significant prior assumption. Amelia stood at the glass partition of her office above and watched. She did not come down immediately. She gave it a moment, gave the room its moment. And then she walked down the stairs. The next morning, she called an all-company leadership meeting. Not a large group, the executive team, the project leads, the department heads, 12 people in the 31st floor conference room. She placed 2 documents on the table. One was the version log from 5 years ago. The other was a summary of the Meridian Core project, with Elijah's name on it as primary architect. She said, "We have a record that needs to be corrected. And I'm correcting it now, in front of the people who run this company." She explained what the version log showed. She explained what had actually happened during the migration crisis. She named Hion. She said clearly, and on record, that the failure 5 years ago had not been Elijah Carter's failure. It had been a manipulation, that the company's investigation had not pursued far enough, and that the consequences of that failure had been placed on the wrong person. No one in the room spoke for a long time. The silence was not empty. It was the silence of 12 people doing the same private arithmetic, recalculating things they thought they had understood, adjusting the weight of a story they had accepted without question, because no one had asked them to question it. Then she said, "I've asked Carter to be present this morning." Elijah was in the room. He was in the back corner, in his maintenance uniform, because he had come from his regular shift. He had not dressed differently. He had not prepared remarks. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his expression calm, and 12 people who had been making judgments about him based on his job title and his uniform looked at him and found that the calculation did not resolve the way it had before. 3 days after the meeting, Richard Brooks arrived at the office unannounced. He was 62, and moved more carefully than he used to, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has begun thinking about legacy and has not fully finished the thought. He found Elijah on the 14th floor, doing a routine panel inspection. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Elijah saw him. Neither of them moved. Richard Brooks said, "I owe you an apology that is long overdue." Elijah looked at him. "Yes," he said, "you do. I'm not going to make excuses. I knew the investigation was incomplete. I knew Huson's involvement was probable. I chose stability over truth, and I told myself it was the right call for the company." He paused. "It wasn't. And you paid for it." Elijah said nothing for a moment. He looked at the panel housing he had been about to open. He looked at the corridor, at the lights, at the building around them that was still running on his work. "I have a daughter," he said finally. She's doing all right. We're doing all right. A beat. That's not nothing. Richard Brooks nodded slowly. No, he said. It isn't. He left. He did not offer a settlement number, a title, a restoration of position. Perhaps he understood that those were not the things Elijah had ever been after. Or perhaps he simply didn't know what to offer a man who had already rebuilt his life around something that could not be taken back. Elijah did not accept a position at Brooks Capital. Amelia offered one a senior architecture consulting role, generous terms, flexible hours. The kind of arrangement that recognized both what he had done and what he had chosen to walk away from. He thanked her and declined. He stayed in his maintenance role for another 3 weeks while he finished a certification course he had enrolled in a structural systems program that would qualify him for independent consulting work. He had been thinking about it for a while. It was not glamorous, but it was his. And it would let him set his own hours, which meant he could do school drop-off. On his last day, he signed out at the maintenance desk at 4:45, the same as always. Amelia was in the lobby when he came through. Not waiting for him, or not obviously so. She was looking at something on her phone when he came through the turnstile, and she looked up as if it were coincidental, and he accepted the fiction of it because it was kind. Good luck, she said. Same to you, he said. She watched him walk out through the glass doors. Through the lobby windows she could see, past the sidewalk, a small girl in a yellow coat, standing beside a parked car, holding a gray stuffed rabbit and watching the building entrance with focused intensity. When Elijah pushed through the doors, the girl ran toward him. He crouched down and caught her, and Sophie Carter threw her arms around his neck and said something into his shoulder that Amelia, from inside the lobby, could not hear. She did not need to. Amelia stood at the glass for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she turned back toward the elevators, toward the 31st floor, toward the company her father had built, and that she now ran differently with more listening, more looking, more attention to the people who existed below the level at which power usually looks. She had not become a different person. She was still precise, still controlled, still the kind of woman who knew where all the exits were, but she had learned to be less certain of what she already knew when she walked into a room. That was not nothing either. In a park 2 miles from Meridian Tower, on a bench near a fountain that was not running yet because it was still early in the season, Elijah sat with Sophie, and they ate sandwiches he had made that morning, and watched pigeons conduct their inexplicable business near the fountain edge. Sophie was telling him about the spelling test. She had gotten all 12 words right. She was reporting this not with pride exactly, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who had prepared well and expected the correct result. At some point, the conversation shifted, the way conversations with 6-year-olds always eventually do sideways, through a gap that adults don't see coming. Baba, Sophie said, with the seriousness that meant the question had been forming for a while. Are you famous? He looked at her. She was holding Wallace against her chest, the button eye catching the afternoon light. No, he said. He thought about it for one more second. But I did the right thing. Sophie considered this with the gravity it deserved. She held Wallace up and seemed to be relaying the answer to him in a low, serious murmur that Elijah could not quite make out. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied with whatever Wallace had offered in return. She reached over and stole the second half of his sandwich. He let her.